Clem? Whoa, hold it right there. What if all of this just didn't happen? I've seen a lot of people asking questions about the characters who we never got to see again in the Walking Dead Telltale series, whether they were killed off, like a lot of them seem to be, or if they just leave. Many people want to know what would have happened if Telltale were less harsh on the characters we meet, and how different the story would be if they were still with us. The thought to make alternate storylines involving these missing characters into games have been an interesting idea often brought up in the Walking Dead community. So what if Lee wasn't bit by the Walker in season 1? What if Molly stayed with the group in Savannah? And what if Lilly didn't lose her temper on the road? With the help of my good friend LeNNY, those questions will be discussed in this video, so sit back, relax, and feel free to leave your ideas in the comments too. Despite Clementine being the main character in season 2 to 4 of the Walking Dead Telltale series, Lee is undoubtedly the face of the game. With season 1 being widely accepted as the best game of the series, you'd expect Lee to be the main character throughout most, if not all of the series, just like Rick Grimes in the TV show. But with Lee's unfortunate mishap at the end of episode 4, season 1, we never got to see the true potential of his character, and a lot of people believe that had he survived, the future may have gone a lot smoother for the now orphaned Clementine and her group. For the sake of accuracy, I'll primarily discuss how season 2 may have changed, rather than plucking at straws to try and imagine how Lee could have impacted something so much further down the line. Lee leaves the story after finally succumbing to the bite he'd received after beginning his search for the kidnapped Clementine, and even with its infection and clearly withering physical state, he was able to overcome the man who took her, saving her in the end, but as everyone knows, he eventually couldn't keep going, and his apocalypse daughter had to put him down. I think it's fair to say that the final episode of season 1 would have basically played out exactly the same if Lee hadn't have been bit by the zombie. Except of course, Lee wouldn't get his arm chopped off. But it's still quite amusing to imagine this play out with him being completely fine. The group would have still gone along with Lee to help find Clem, and Ben would have still died after falling from the balcony, along with Kenny leaving the story to try his best to help Ben. Lee would have obviously still taken out the kidnapper, you'd expect with more ease, but rather afterwards, both Lee and Clem would have found their way out of Savannah, presumably coming together with Krista and Omid heading into the second season of the game. The first notable change that I imagine would have happened comes right at the start of season 2, in which we get stunned by the death of Omid in the service station bathroom. Clementine gets left to head inside to clean herself up, and for whatever reason, Krista and Omid aren't about to prevent this looter from following her in, robbing her and inevitably killing Omid after she hears someone enter the building. With Lee around, this simply wouldn't have happened or got anywhere near to happening. Despite Lee beginning to try and teach Clementine to become more independent to be able to defend herself in season 1, he was still exceedingly protective of her afterwards. He played a pivotal role in being Clementine's father figure, continuously guiding her through the complexities of surviving in such a harsh environment and the incredibly troubling moral decisions that are faced so often in the game. His survival into season 2 would have meant that Clementine would always have an emotional anchor attached to her in order to protect and aid her with many of the difficult choices that she faced. One of the main questions I see is about whether or not Clem would have been as mature as she was in season 2 if Lee was still around. Clem was without a doubt the most mature and reasonable person in the entirety of season 2 of The Walking Dead, to the point that people online complained about how silly it was for so many adults in the game to be reliant on her opinions and decisions, despite her only being 11. This can be explained by the fact that, well, she is the playable character, and without her opinions being put into use, it would make the game far less interactive than it's made to be. However, I think it's reasonable to say that the death of Lee and the subsequent loneliness that followed for the next 16 months meant that Clementine was forced to become independent in her survival. If Lee was still to be around, would Clementine still have become so bold and brave and taking unexpected leadership roles, or would he have held her back from becoming the strong survivor that we see in season 2? We can see what happens when a child's overly protected in the apocalypse on a couple of occasions, neither ending up positively. Could Lee making it into season 2 have actually decreased Clementine's survival chance? In season 2 we have a 16-month gap separating the original scene of Omid dying and the scene where Krista and Clem find themselves alone in the woods. The atmosphere is dull and the two are clearly very distant, with Krista seemingly giving blame to Clem as suggested from her facial expressions and their incredibly limited dialogue. But with Omid alive and Lee around too, the group would be far more lively, even if Krista's pregnancy had the same outcome. I don't doubt that the four of them would have also put up a good fight against the men in the woods that attacked Krista and Clem, but for the sake of the theories, let's pretend they split up again, with Lee leaving with Clementine this time to come across the cabin where the season 2 group reside. When Clementine arrived at the cabin in season 2, the atmosphere was very hostile, with her arriving with a huge bite on her arm. Despite it coming from a dog, almost the entire group believed it was a zombie bite, leaving Clem outside in the shed. Lee had dealt with a situation like this before in season 1, in which we were introduced to many of the core characters at the pharmacy in Macon. Duck had been pinned down in the streets, and when brought inside, some of the group were on the offensive, angry at the idea that a bitten person had been allowed in. Lee was an effortless leader of the group, often finding himself dealing with many troubling situations himself. Even if he wasn't the elected leader, he always found a way to keep angry people at bay and knew how to make people trust him and the group. We probably wouldn't have seen such hostile behaviour directed towards Clementine from people such as Rebecca and Nick, and despite the fact that Pete probably would have still died by the river, I think some of the fallouts that had happened in the group wouldn't have happened, or would have at least been more peaceful with a less divided group. Now, I absolutely cannot go this video without mentioning Carver. It is certain that if Lee was to survive into season 2, he would have almost definitely have become the leader of the cabin group. No one, except Clementine, seemed to have a hard shell. Everyone in that group seemed to be a bit of a pushover, and there were so many weak points that were just waiting to crack open, hence why they seemed so desperate to just run away from Carver rather than standing their own to fight him off. Lee was a very protective man, all stemming from his initial desire to return Clementine to her parents, doing anything he could in the process to keep her safe. He wasn't just protective to her though, and as mentioned earlier, he was the first one to step in and defend Duck from Larry in the pharmacy, not scared to use intimidation to keep those in his group safe and to put people down a peg or two. When it came to Carver, Kenny was the only one who showed relatively little fear towards him, but he wasn't able to do so in the right way to benefit the group, and he never really fought back either. In fact, Carver never had a fight in which someone was willing to fight back. Yes, he beat the absolute shit out of Kenny, but he let it happen to protect Clementine. Lee had proven on multiple occasions that he was able to win a fistfight convincingly, even if he was on the verge of death with a missing limb. I don't doubt that Carver would have been taken out earlier on than he was if Lee were alive, the only possible thorn in our side being Troy, of course. Any other henchman would have probably just let it happen. It is then worth noting that the group would have left Carver's warehouse camp way before the huge horde arrived, meaning many people would have survived the escape, most importantly, Sarita. The death of Sarita following her getting bitten in the horde outside Carver's camp inevitably led to the emotional decline of Kenny, which made up the majority of the final 2 episodes of the season. Just like with the death of Duck and Catcher, Sarita's passing hit Kenny hard, and with his outbursts and uncontrollable aggression, he inadvertently caused the tragic ending of Luke, Arvo's group, in some instances Bonnie, Jane, and even himself. After failing to keep everyone that he'd loved alive, he was out for himself and himself only, disregarding anyone and everyone. Even if Lee wasn't able to prevent Sarita's death, he was the only one that had proven to reach Kenny in his lowest state, back on the train in season 1. Lee is really quite an understanding and empathetic person who had shown time and time again that he is the person that people can come to if they needed to open up. He had clearly gone through difficult times himself during the affair that his wife and the state senator had. Although committing a horrible crime, the emotions he'd gone through gave him the perfect experience to settle and survive in the apocalypse, and that's why he would have easily helped Kenny out of the chasm of depression and hatred that he'd found himself in again, possibly preventing or diffusing many of the violent and edgy clashes that Kenny had with some of the group members. It's very possible that with Lee's experience, leadership, and rationality that everything would have gone just a whole lot smoother.
If there was anyone from Telltale's The Walking Dead universe that was a mystery of where exactly they ended up, it would have to be Molly. It's not just her backstory with her sister that made her interesting, but the fact of how well she was able to handle herself when it came to survival in sheer combat. But the question that we have to ask is what would have happened if Molly did decide to stay with the group? Now with Molly staying, it does bring in a few key differences on how the story would play out. In my theory, the story would play out pretty much the same from the time Lee gets bit up until they get stuck in the attic in the mansion. During this time, the radio that Lee has goes off, and so he hears Clementine on the other side. Lee figuring out and mentioning that the guy on the radio has her at the same spot her parents go on vacation, the Marsh House. Quick side note, with this decision to go to the Marsh House and to go rooftop to head to River Street where the Marsh House is nearby, if you pay attention, the Marsh House was actually across the street from where Lee and Kenny were trying to find a boat at. You will notice plenty of signs and landmarks that showed that the same place the group were heading towards was the same place that we first meet Molly. You'll also see that where Lee was fighting off the Walker horde by himself, you will see the same dead sign that we see in episode 4, with the Marsh House being essentially down the street from them. What I'm trying to say is that it sucks to know that Clementine would have already met her parents, and the stranger for that matter, if Lee remembered where he was on the map. Clementine herself, before Lee and Kenny went out, said that where they were heading, her parents shouldn't be that far from there.
We can do both. Ben, you take one last look around the place. Grab anything that looks useful, while me and Kenny go down to the river to get us a boat.
Wait, can't I come? My mom and dad can't be far now. Maybe we can look for them on the way to the river.
Which she was right. So imagine everything from that point onward could have been avoided. Lee getting bit, Clementine never being captured by the stranger, Lee perhaps not dying, and everyone else more than likely being alive or not missing. Anyways, back to Molly. With the team going to River Street, having Molly in the group, I believe she would be a great asset considering her knowledge of where everything is in Savannah and the Bells. My theory is she would suggest going by herself to get to one of the bells to help the group get into the marsh house safely without having to deal with any walkers. Kenny most likely would still go missing, whether it would be trying to save Ben or save Krista, due to the amount of time it would take Molly to get to one of the bell towers to have the walkers move from one spot to another. In terms of having Lee get to the marsh house, I believe otherwise. With the location where the group is, that being at River Street, it would make sense for Molly to use the same bell that she used in episode 4 where Kenny and Lee were heading to River Street. If you remember, that same bell allowed the walkers to go west from the marsh house.
Son of a bitch. That bastard's fucking with us again. It's another trap.
No, listen. That's not the same bell as before. This one's further off. Whatever it is, it's gonna get the dead moving over there.
What in the hell is going on?
With that leaves it to where even though Lee ends up on the street after crossing the Maccabee sign, the scene where he goes through multiple walkers to get to the marsh house wouldn't even be a thing due to the bell tower Molly rings. If any walkers were to be there, it would be very few. Given the fact that Lee wouldn't have to deal with the walkers before and after the marsh house, leaves Lee with a bit more energy than he originally had in the main story. With this though, it would make it to where Lee and Clementine wouldn't know about the trick that being covered in walker guts makes it to where the walkers wouldn't be able to sense you. This not being a need to know since there wouldn't be hardly any walkers around to get all the blood and guts onto them. There are a few things that could happen because of Molly ringing the bells. One being the fact that Lee could either still pass out, making it to where Clementine drags him into the nearby jewelry store to keep him away from walkers, or since there hardly would be anything around, she could try to wake Lee up in the middle of the street. Either way, Clementine could still help him get inside a nearby store. And two, Clementine wouldn't actually see her parents. After leaving the marsh house like she does in the original story, because of all them moving to the nearby bell tower. With that being the case, it's hard to really say whether or not Clementine would still be adamant about finding her parents still, or give up on the idea that they are even there to begin with completely due to Lee's situation with the bite and the fact that he's dying. So it's fair to say that either way you go about it, Lee would still end up dying. I do however see that perhaps after Lee's death, Molly would go out of her way to find Omida and Krista, if not them, at least Clementine. With helping Lee trying to find her, in a way it would make sense for Molly to want to redeem herself by finding Clementine, make amends with not being able to save her sister in the end in regards to Crawford.
Lilly happened to be one of the more interesting personalities in season 1 of The Walking Dead, and I never really knew where we as Lee stood with her. On one hand, she seemed stern, powerful and determined, whereas on the other hand, she sometimes seemed vulnerable, lonely and scared. I'd argue that she's one of the most complex characters we got to know in the game, and it's kind of a shame that she was removed so early on in the series. Now, I am aware that this isn't the last time we see her in the Telltale franchise, but I'm yet to play that part, so once again, I'll primarily focus on her impact on season 1, and partially if she was to survive into season 2. The last time we see Lilly, for a very long while, is when she murders Doug, or in most cases Carly, near the end of episode 3 in season 1, after the group flee the motel that they'd been staying in after being forced out by the bandits, a vicious group that previously attacked us at the dairy farm. Someone, who we later find out to be Ben, had been sneaking group supplies to them in order to try and make peace, and such led to the downfall of Lilly. Lilly's ruthless but fair behaviour established her as a strong leader for the apocalypse, and she was someone who cared deeply for the people she loved, as we saw with how she treated her father Larry, despite his cruel and uncensored behaviour towards her and other people. She was, however, understanding and apologetic when it came to taking response for what her dad might have done, but over time, we saw her slowly become less strong in herself, when paranoia and lack of trust started developing once Kenny turned Larry's head into ketchup, after he'd passed away from a heart attack when the group were locked in a meat fridge. She began blaming everyone else and had slowly become a mirror image of her dad, and after murdering an innocent member of the group over an accident, it was impossible to let her stay with us. But what if Lilly didn't lose her temper and was kept with the group? Would she still have been a valuable member even if Lee did take leadership as he did? The simple answer to that question would simply be that she would have taken any chance to leave the group, as she had lost all her trust in them and felt almost alienated due to the pressure of being the leader. Whether it be taking the train while it was unattended, or whether it be her to steal the boat in Savannah rather than Vernon, it's likely Lilly would have just left. The death of Larry was really what sent her spiraling over the edge, and after that, she would have taken any chance she could to get a new start, where she could find herself in a new leadership role where she was at her strongest. If Crawford was to still be standing, she would have without a doubt taken a place in the hierarchy there, as she was a true survivalist at heart. However, if she hadn't lost her temper and continued to remain a stable character in the group, I believe she would have been an incredibly valuable member, even if she did take a more subordinate role. She was one of the only people to properly see through Kenny's plans to continue on the move, regardless of how he wanted to do it. She continuously challenged him for his underplanned decisions, being far more sensible and realistic when it came to what would benefit the group the most.
Do you ever want to leave here?
I want to leave here when we have to, not because of some fantasy of somewhere better.
So, you think the coast is a pipe dream?
Don't you? We're going to live on the water because we assume they can't swim? We're alive because we've stayed here. That's as far as the discussion needs to go.
For example, in Savannah, Kenny was determined to find a boat and get it running to allow the group to find a safe escape. But of course, this wasn't an easy task. In fact, indirectly leading to the death of Bree, and in some instances Ben after looting Crawford for the required parts. If Lilly was still around though, she would have known from the off how ridiculous of an idea it was, and in a domino effect, it's likely that Clem wouldn't have been kidnapped, and ultimately, the group wouldn't have remained in Savannah for long enough to see Lee get bitten. Heading into season 2, it would have been interesting to see her interaction with Carver. Like Kenny and Lee, Lilly had a fearless attitude, not allowing herself to be taken advantage of by someone who, let's be honest, she could probably beat the shit out of. She without a doubt would have taken a head-on approach to taking down Carver. Pre-apocalypse, she was surrounded by soldiers, working at an army base with Larry being in the force himself. Both her and Carver shared a similarity in their authoritarian leadership, but of course, Lilly actually had morals. She would have had far more respect as a leader than the barbaric Carver, and if not tackling him directly, she could have without a doubt led some sort of fight back against Carver, rallying members like Tavia and Bonnie, which of course Clementine couldn't do with her lack of stature. She certainly wouldn't have stood for Carver's brutality, and the retaliation against him would have happened far earlier, likely preventing some of the deaths and life-changing injuries that were received. However, it is obvious that Lilly does her utmost to make decisions that are in the overall group's best interest, as we saw with her reluctance to allow Ben and his teacher into the group, especially with their dwindling food supply. I wouldn't have been surprised if she'd sacrificed the very weak members of the group, such as Sarah or Nick, in order to keep everyone else safe. Finally, I think Lilly would have played a pivotal role in providing a more stable, experienced, and useful mentor to Clementine, especially as without murdering Carly or Doug, she wouldn't have shaped Clementine's opinion on her in such a poor way. Lilly, like Lee, was able to make difficult decisions in order to best ensure survival, although in a more harsh way than Lee would have. A lot of people complain that the people that Clementine are left to look up to are either not experienced enough, unpredictable, or just straight up batshit crazy. Lilly would have served as a logical protector of Clementine, allowing her to continue to flourish into the independent survivor that we've seen her become, whilst also acting as a shield that keeps her alive, but doesn't stunt her development into the fantastic main character that she is now. I hope you enjoyed this style of video, and make sure to leave your opinions in the comments. I really enjoy seeing everyone's theories or thoughts about the games I play, whether they're positive or negative. It's always super thought-provoking to look through what you guys have to say. Thanks for watching.